From the newsrooms of the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, this is Please Explain. I'm Kate Orbison. It's Thursday, April 27. Children as young as 10 can be arrested, charged and jailed as criminals in Australia. But tomorrow, Australia's Attorneys General will consider raising the age of criminal responsibility nationally. It comes after the Victorian government announced it would lift its minimum age of culpability from 10 to 12 and eventually 14 years old.
Children under the age of 12 would no longer be criminally culpable in Victoria under plans agreed to by state ministers.
But the decision has been slammed by legal and medical experts, Indigenous and social advocacy groups, who say the reform doesn't go far enough, old enough, or come soon enough. Today, state political reporter for The Age, Sumeyya Ilanbey, on the question, how young is too young when it comes to criminal culpability? Sumeyya, currently, as soon as children hit double digits, they can be arrested and charged with a crime in some jurisdictions, including New South Wales. How did we get to this seemingly arbitrary age cutoff for criminal responsibility?
It is arbitrary and it's not based on science or medical evidence at all. Under English common law, the age of criminal responsibility was 7, while Dolly Incapac, so that's the legal construct that children under the minimum age of criminal responsibility cannot be charged because they cannot form criminal intent, was 14. That minimum age of criminal responsibility in the UK was raised to 8 and then 10 in the 20th century, and Australia just happened to follow suit. For example, in Canada, the minimum age of criminal responsibility is 12, in Scandinavian countries it's 15, and in Belgium it's 18. Most jurisdictions across the world also have lower maximum penalties, so there are different cultural and societal approaches.
Right, and what we've seen in Victoria in the last few days is they've committed to raising the age from 10 to 12 and then to 14 by 2027. Momentum has been growing for a while now to raise this age of criminal responsibility. What's been driving this momentum and Victoria's decision in particular?
So currently the minimum age of criminal responsibility around the entire country is 10. The Northern Territory introduced legislation last year to increase it to 12. The ACT will soon introduce legislation to increase it to 12 and then up to 14 in 2 years' time. In Tasmania, the minimum age of detention is 14. And as you foreshadowed, Victoria will raise the age of criminality to 12 by the end of next year and then to 14 by 2027. There's been calls for years and decades essentially, but what it goes back to is in 2018, legal and medical experts had called for the age of criminal responsibility to be lifted to 16. In response, the Attorneys General across the country decided to investigate the matter and they established a working group. The working group had recommended that it be lifted to 14 with exceptions or to 12 with no exceptions at all. While that work was undergoing, in 2019, the United Nations chastised Australia for failing to raise the age and the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in custody.
Canada recommends that Australia, 1, increase the minimum age of criminal responsibility and adopt measures to ensure children receive appropriate community support.
Raise the minimum age of criminal responsibility.
In 2020, the working group handed down its report to the Attorneys General. The Attorneys General at the time couldn't reach national consensus, but they decided that 12 was, looking a lot more palatable than 14. And I think calls have just been growing increasingly since, particularly in line with the international evidence, international standards, human rights standards, as well as medical experts around the development of kids' brains.
Yeah, I really want to talk to you about that evidence in terms of brain development in a little while. But first, I want to know more about these children who are being arrested, remanded, convicted or jailed in Australia and the kinds of crimes that they're being accused of.
So we know that children, and there's been a lot of evidence and a lot of research conducted into this, and what we know is that children under the age of 14 who enter the justice system are more likely to be suffering from underlying trauma, they have an undiagnosed disorder, and they come from poorer families. And more than half of all children in detention from the ages between 10 and 17 had interaction with child protection. We know that children of more marginalised communities and vulnerable cohorts, particularly vulnerable communities who come from very disadvantaged backgrounds, to be targeted by these laws.
On the stream, we ask, why are so many Indigenous young people imprisoned in Australia, some as young as 10 years old?
Whether they're Aboriginal people who are traditionally overrepresented both in the adult criminal justice system but also the youth justice system.
Is even higher. Indigenous Australians are just 3% of the general population, but over 27% of those in prison, making them the most incarcerated people on earth per capita, on a per capita basis.
And we know that particularly here in Victoria, we know that children of Sudanese, South Sudanese and Pacific Islander backgrounds are also disproportionately overrepresented in the youth justice system.
Boys like cry out for help, but they don't do nothing. It's not really a place like you want to be, but you got no choice at the end of the day. You're in white people's hands.
And what protections do these children have within the legal system?
So it's what's called Dolly Incapax, which, as I said before, it's the legal presumption that kids between the ages of 10 and 14 are incapable of forming criminal intent. It is incumbent upon the prosecution, so the prosecution has the onus to prove that that kid who's been charged with allegedly committing an offence did have the mental capacity to know that their behaviour was seriously wrong. However, legal experts, including the Victorian government, have said that Dolly Incapax is fraught with problems. Leading criminologist Chris Cunneen, for example, a few years ago said that in practice the reverse onus often applies, so it's up to the defence to prove that the kid was mentally incapable. The United Nations has also argued that Dolly Incapax has been applied inconsistently and fails to provide adequate protection for children.
Right, and the decision in Victoria to raise the age to 12 has been heavily criticised by a fair few stakeholder groups, including the Royal Australasian College of Physicians. Where did their objections stem from?
So it goes back to the medical evidence regarding kids' brain development. The medical consensus regarding child brain development shows that children under 14 are undergoing significant growth and development, which means that they don't have the required mental capacity. It also notes that immaturity affects cognitive functioning, including impulsivity, as well as consequential thinking. We know that young children who have contact with any part of the criminal justice system, including police, have an increased risk of reoffending and reoffending into adulthood too.
Conversely, the move to raise the age at all is facing political opposition. Where is this opposition coming from?
So I think there's an element of the populist law and order rhetoric that we've had in this country for quite some time, but there are also concerns by police who say that they're arresting kids under the age of 14 who are accused mainly of property crime, including aggravated burglaries. The Victorian opposition here also says that raising the age will not tackle the root causes of crime, while WA Premier Mark McGowan, for example, said he wouldn't be responding to quote-unquote activist calls. He also says that he doesn't believe that 13-year-olds who murder or sexually assault people should be able to get away with it. So governments across the country have needed to balance public safety with the welfare of young kids accused of crime.
Australia's Attorneys Generals are meeting tomorrow. This issue is on the agenda. What do you think will come from this meeting? Are we going to see an agreement on this issue, or is there likely to be significant pushback?
I don't think we'll see a national consensus come out of the Attorneys General meeting tomorrow. As I mentioned, WA Premier Mark McGowan is resisting those calls. The Queensland Attorney General recently said she supported the calls to raise the age of criminal responsibility, but hasn't really indicated whether it should rise to 12 or to 14, whether or not there should be exceptions. We don't know what the position of the New South Wales government is, and the South Australian government recently indicated that they would investigate the matter. I do note that the Victorian Attorney General, Jacqueline Symes, said that she was hoping to achieve national consensus, or at least consensus, particularly with Victoria's border states of South Australia and New South Wales.
Right, to have a consistent law.
So if you're on the Victorian border and you're a 12-year-old child, for example, from next year you'll be deemed mentally incapable of forming criminal intent. But if you happen to be on the New South Wales border, you could be still charged by police. So I think it's just about having that level of consistency between states and territories.
And say we do stop arresting, convicting and jailing children who aren't yet teenagers in every jurisdiction. What's the alternative? What do we do with children involved in criminal behaviour?
I think it's what we do for children who are involved in criminal behaviour under the age of 10. A lot more wraparound services, a lot more early intervention programs. It's to keep children away from the criminal justice system so they're not committing offences into adulthood. So a lot of the experts want better investment in early intervention, better wraparound services and the early targeting of what the root cause of the crime is.
Sumeyya, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Today's episode of Please Explain was produced by Julia Carcatzel, with technical assistance from Cormac Lally. Our executive producer is Ruby Schwartz. Please Explain is a production of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. If you enjoy the show and want to support our journalism, subscribe to our newspapers today. It's the best way to support what we do. Search The Age or smh.com.au/subscribe. I'm Kate Orbison. This is Please Explain. Thanks for listening.